They say she's lonely. They say she gave up. But the truth is far more dangerous. She didn't settle. She didn't shrink. She chose a life without a man. Not because she stopped believing in love, but because she refused to keep calling pain by that name. In a world where a woman's worth is measured by who she belongs to, she became a threat. Because she belonged to no one, not even to the idea of needing someone. Carl Jung once said, "What you deny in yourself becomes your shadow." This video isn't about being single. It's about what happens when a woman stops begging to be seen and starts seeing herself. Don't skip this, because once you understand why she walked away, you may start asking yourself, what if she's not lost? What if she's free? She lives alone, not because she's lost, but because she's finally found herself. There was no announcement, no dramatic collapse, no long list of the men who hurt her, just a quiet, resolute decision. She would no longer show up in places where her soul had to shrink to fit. No boyfriend. No almosts. No searching. Just presence. But don't mistake it. This wasn't falling apart. It was resurrection. Not born from rage, but from rhythm. The rhythm of a woman who has learned to hear her own breath again, to pour her coffee in, silence without needing anyone to watch, to fall asleep without waiting for someone to say goodnight. You'd think she's lonely. You'd be wrong. She didn't give up on connection. She just stopped mistaking proximity for intimacy. Her life now moves slower, like a melody only she can hear. And somewhere between the noise, she found what most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Herself. She's not lonely. She just stopped waiting for someone else to fill the silence. The world sees her aloneness and assumes absence. But they're wrong. Her life isn't empty. It's intentional, because there's a difference between being alone and being abandoned. One is a wound, the other is a choice. One leaves you aching for rescue, the other teaches you how to breathe underwater. For a long time, she didn't know that difference. She mistook every long night for a punishment. She let her phone fill the silence, scrolling, checking, hoping. She let attention feel like intimacy and busyness feel like meaning. But eventually, the noise stopped working. It stopped covering the echo inside. And in that echo, something whispered. Back, it didn't sound like a lover. It sounded like her own voice. Steady, quiet, familiar. A voice that had always been there, beneath the panic and pretending. That's when she stopped calling her solitude a failure. That's when she realized, loneliness is what you feel when you're disconnected from yourself. Solitude is what you find when you reconnect. So now, when the room is quiet, she doesn't reach for distraction. She doesn't perform for the ghost of who she used to be. She just breathes, fully, freely, finally. And in that breath, something sacred happens. She becomes whole again. Not because someone filled her, but because no one interrupted her. She used to call it love. What she now knows was survival. There was a time she would shrink just to be held, give more than she had, just to feel needed. Stay too long in places that hurt, because at least it meant she wasn't invisible. She memorized the rules of being lovable. Don't be too much. Don't ask too often. Don't need too loudly. So she learned to become small, to burn quietly, hoping someone might notice the smoke. To turn herself into warmth for people who had no intention of staying. But eventually, she got tired of begging for crumbs and calling it a feast. Tired of performing for affection that never felt safe to rest in. Tired of confusing emotional hunger with chemistry. Something inside her broke. But this time, it broke open. And in that breaking, she realized, the love she'd been chasing wasn't love. It was a reenactment, a ritual, a repetition of old wounds dressed in new faces. So she stopped reaching, stopped proving, stopped trying to be chosen by those who didn't know how to see her. And in that stillness, for the first time, she chose herself, not as a backup plan, not as a consolation prize, but as the one who had been there all along, waiting to be loved without condition, without exhaustion, without disappearing. This wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. The end of self-abandonment, the beginning of self-trust. There's something unsettling about a woman who doesn't need to be rescued. She's not waiting at the window. She's not rehearsing how to be softer, quieter, easier to love. She's not shaping herself to fit anyone's story. And that terrifies people, because wholeness can't be controlled. We're taught to admire women who endure, not women who walk away. To praise those who wait, not those who choose themselves. So when she says, "I'm enough," and means it, the world doesn't quite know what to do with her. She disrupts expectations. She breaks scripts. She refuses to play roles that were never written with her soul in mind. She's not bitter. She's clear. She's not angry. She's anchored. That's why people label her as too much, too cold, too distant. Because too much is what they call a woman who no longer shrinks. Too cold is what they say when her boundaries hold. Too distant is how they describe the space she needs to breathe. But in truth, she's not rejecting others. She's just refusing to abandon herself. Her strength isn't loud, it doesn't roar. It hums quietly beneath the surface. Steady, grounded, complete. And that kind of woman, the one who doesn't need saving, fixing, or validating, she becomes dangerous. Not because she harms, but because she reveals. She reveals how fragile the world becomes when a woman no longer plays small just to keep it comfortable. She doesn't try to expose anyone. She doesn't have to. Her existence alone is a confrontation. Because when a woman stops needing approval, she becomes a mirror. One that reflects back all the ways others still seek permission to exist. She unsettles people who are still performing. She triggers those who are still pretending. She awakens questions that most have buried beneath busyness and belonging. What does it mean to live for yourself? What would I see if I stopped hiding? Who am I when I'm not trying to be chosen? These are the questions she never asks out loud. But somehow her presence asks them for you, and most people aren't ready to answer. So they project, they judge, they dismiss her as arrogant, cold, intimidating, not because she is, but because she reveals the parts of them they're not yet willing to meet. She is the shadow made visible, not through drama or demands, but through clarity, boundaries, and peace. She doesn't chase validation. She doesn't seek applause. She simply stands, fully in herself, and that alone makes the room shift. She became everything they told her not to be. And now her freedom makes their fears impossible to ignore. That's why she's misunderstood. Not because she's unclear, but because she's seen too clearly. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't need to. Her life speaks for her, while others chase noise to feel alive. She's learned to listen to the language of stillness. Her choices are quiet, deliberate, and powerful. Not declarations, but decisions. Not performances, but presence. You won't see her broadcasting her boundaries. She simply holds them. You won't hear her demanding to be loved. She just stops showing up where she's not. It's not coldness. It's discernment. She's no longer available to things that fracture her peace. And that whisper, the one beneath her words, beneath her eyes, it says more than any speech ever could. I will not abandon myself for connection again. She used to believe she had to explain everything. Why she left, why she said no, why she chose silence. But now she knows. Peace doesn't need justification. And not every truth deserves an audience. Her power lives in subtlety, in restraint, in the courage it takes to walk away quietly rather than scream to be understood. This is not weakness. This is sovereignty, because when a woman whispers her boundaries instead of shouting her pain, she's not being passive. She's being precise. And that kind of clarity, it echoes long after she's left the room. They say she's missing something. No partner, no ring, no timeline to follow, so they assume she must be searching. Or worse, she must be broken, because we've been conditioned to believe that a woman alone is a woman unfinished. But she's not searching. She's not waiting. She's not half of anything. She is the whole damn story. And that story doesn't begin with being chosen. It begins with choosing. She doesn't need to explain her joy to those who call it emptiness. She doesn't need to prove her worth through someone else's presence. Because her life is not an audition. It's an arrival. Every time someone says, "You're too picky," what they really mean is, "You're not settling like we did." Every time someone says, "You should be more open," what they mean is, "Your standards scare us." But she's not here to soothe their discomfort. She's here to honor her soul. And honoring your soul? Sometimes that means standing alone. Not because you couldn't find love, but because you refuse to shrink for it. She doesn't fear solitude. She fears pretending again. And if wholeness costs her approval, she'll pay that price with peace. Because she's not incomplete. She's just unwilling to trade depth for belonging, and that is power most won't understand. She doesn't show up everywhere. But when she does, you feel it. Her absence isn't empty. It's intentional. It's a boundary drawn not from distance, but from depth. People say she's hard to reach. But maybe it's not that she's far away. Maybe it's that she's standing still in a world that never stops running. She no longer performs availability. She no longer floods spaces that can't hold her. She's not everywhere for everyone. She's right where she belongs. And when she's quiet, it's not because she has nothing to say. It's because she's listening to her energy, to her nervous system, to the space between stimulus and response. That kind of presence isn't loud, but it's powerful. It recalibrates the room. It brings clarity where there was clutter. She has become the kind of woman who doesn't chase attention, but commands it without trying, because she's not withholding. She's simply rooted. She's not missing. She's just no longer leaking. You can call it mystery. You can call it distance. But the truth? What you're feeling isn't her absence. It's her gravity. Her solitude wasn't an escape. It was a descent, not into loneliness, but into the parts of herself she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. She didn't just walk away from others. She walked toward her own shadow, the parts that longed to be chosen, the wounds that whispered she wasn't enough. The ghosts of childhood that taught her love and pain were the same thing. Carl Jung said, "What you don't make conscious will rule your life, and you will call it fate." And for years, she had done just that. Calling chaos chemistry, calling abandonment love, calling her hunger for validation just how it is. But solitude stripped away the noise. No distractions, no roles to play. Just her, and the truth waiting beneath the silence. And it wasn't pretty. Shadow work never is. It's sitting with memories you swore you forgot, naming patterns that once felt like protection, grieving parts of yourself you had to abandon just to survive. It's learning that some of your desires weren't yours. They were inherited, programmed, projected onto you by people who never knew your soul. And yet, she stayed. She stayed in the discomfort. She stayed in the unraveling. She stayed long enough to meet the version of herself that didn't need fixing, just witnessing. That's the paradox of true healing. It looks like falling apart. But really, it's returning to the place you were never meant to leave. She doesn't flinch when people leave. She doesn't chase when someone pulls away. And for that, they call her cold, detached, unreachable. But what they're really seeing is emotional maturity. And emotional maturity scares people who've only known love as chaos. She's not avoiding connection. She's avoiding self-abandonment. She's not rejecting intimacy. She's rejecting patterns that made her disappear. She no longer begs for closure. She no longer explains her boundaries. She no longer overextends to prove she's worthy. Because she knows. The right people don't need convincing. The right love doesn't ask you to betray yourself to keep it. And yet, this clarity comes at a cost. People misunderstand her peace as pride, her discernment as judgment, her silence as attitude. But she's not bitter. She's not guarded. She's just done bleeding for lessons she already learned. This isn't indifference. It's wisdom. The kind of wisdom that comes from surviving yourself, from holding your own hand when no one else did, from staying when everything inside you wanted to run. She still wants love. She still hopes to be held, but not at the cost of her softness, not at the expense of her soul. She's not intimidating. She's just not performing anymore. And if that makes her hard to love, maybe the definition of love needs to change. She used to stay longer than she should have, hoping that if she gave enough, bent enough, dimmed enough, someone would finally choose her. She didn't know then that love isn't earned through sacrifice, that true connection doesn't require proof, that begging isn't a pathway to belonging. It's a symptom of forgetting your own worth. So she stopped answering half-hearted messages, stopped rationalizing mixed signals, stopped pouring into hands that never reached back. She no longer confuses effort with alignment. She no longer mistakes attention for affection. She no longer negotiates her needs just to feel wanted, because she knows now. Real love doesn't ask you to audition. It recognizes you. It resonates. So when people say she's closed off, what they're really seeing is that she has boundaries now. When they say she's hard to reach, what they mean is, she's no longer chasing. She's not playing hard to get. She's hard to manipulate. She's not waiting to be picked. She's waiting to feel met. And until that happens, she'll choose peace over potential, solitude over survival mode, truth over temporary comfort. Because crumbs were never meant to feed a woman who finally remembered she was whole. She still wants love. Of course she does. She still wants to be held, to be seen, to be chosen, but not at the cost of disappearing. She's no longer interested in relationships that ask her to fold herself down into something more manageable. She won't make herself smaller to be digestible. She won't dim her truth to be palatable. Because the love she's looking for now doesn't come wrapped in approval. It doesn't arrive as performance. It arrives as presence. She doesn't need someone to save her. She needs someone who's done saving themselves, someone who's met their own shadow, who doesn't fear her fire or her silence. She doesn't want to be pedestalized. She wants to be met, in the depth, in the stillness, in the wild truth of her becoming. And until that love arrives, she will not make herself bleed for a bond. She will not betray her softness for survival. She will not trade her soul for someone else's comfort. She knows now. True love doesn't shrink you to fit into its life. It expands to meet you where you already are. Her peace doesn't come from avoidance. It comes from alignment. It's not built on pretending. It's built on presence. And that kind of peace, the unshakable kind, the kind that doesn't perform or beg or explain, it makes people nervous. Because a woman who's found peace within herself can no longer be controlled through fear. She doesn't play small to be liked. She doesn't contort to be understood. She doesn't hustle to be chosen. She simply is. And that being, without apology or approval, is a direct threat to every system that profits from her insecurity. So they label her too intense, too independent, too much. But what they really mean is, she's not available for manipulation anymore. She no longer seeks peace outside herself because she's become the source of it. And that disrupts everything built on the assumption that a woman must be unsettled to be lovable. She's not bitter. She's balanced. Not angry. Aware. Not unreachable. Just unwilling to self-abandon again. Her peace didn't come from a partner, a promise, or a pedestal. It came from finally sitting in her own silence and deciding it was enough. And that kind of peace? It doesn't scream. It just doesn't flinch. She used to live in survival mode. Hyper-aware, always scanning the room, always ready to shapeshift into who she thought they needed her to be. Love, to her, meant alertness. Affection meant performance. Safety meant silence. But survival mode is not a life. It's a suspension. You can't build intimacy while bracing for impact. You can't receive love when your nervous system is still fighting invisible wars. So she stopped bracing. She stopped mistaking vigilance for strength, stopped confusing self-abandonment for loyalty, stopped calling exhaustion normal. Instead, she chose presence. She chose rest. She chose slowness. And in that stillness, something remarkable happened. Her body began to trust her again. Her heart began to open, not to just anyone, but to herself. She stopped trying to survive relationships and started choosing ones that made her feel safe enough to be fully alive. She no longer measures love by how much she can endure. She measures it by how much she can be. Because beyond survival mode is a life where softness is safe and love doesn't hurt to hold. She lives alone now. Not because no one wanted her, but because for the first time, she chose herself. She no longer waits for the knock, no longer stares at the door, no longer builds homes in hearts that weren't ready to hold her. She walks her space slowly now. The silence doesn't scare her. The stillness doesn't accuse her. It welcomes her. She sips tea without checking her phone. She reads without needing to be seen. She feels without filtering. Because the life she lives now is not built on fear or longing or lack, but on wholeness. A wholeness carved not by perfection, but by pain. Not by applause, but by absence. She is not untouched by love. She's simply no longer willing to be undone by it, and maybe the world doesn't understand her quiet joy. Maybe they still think she's missing something, but she knows better. She hasn't lost. She hasn't withdrawn. She has simply returned. Returned to her truth. Returned to her rhythm. Returned to the one person who never left. Herself. Maybe the story you just heard wasn't really about her. Maybe it was about the part of you that's been quietly asking, what would my life look like if I stopped trying to be someone else's home and started coming home to myself? If that question still lingers, let it. Because some questions aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to unfold. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this video moved something in you, helped you feel seen, or simply gave you space to breathe, tap that like button and subscribe to Mind Lens. New journeys into the mind and soul every single week. Until next time. Stay true, stay whole, and most of all, stay with yourself.